Listen, there's been a mistake here. I needed to pass this message on to our Supreme Leader Joe Biden and Comrade Kamala, yes, Queen, we stand. So, I know I look like an incredibly straight white male, but just hear me out. So, I am straight, apart from one time when I was 16 and I had a boner for one of my male school friends, although I was a bit shy and nothing ever came of it.
Beta!
I am and always have been male, although I've often been told that I have a kind of feminine energy. But I am half Middle Eastern, which means I've experienced a good bit of Islamophobia in my life, despite my entire family being Catholic, because that's how that works. My background is working class, and I did grow up in one of the poorest communities in Scotland, but I did manage to get a degree in the end. Sociology, not one of those fake ones like pronoun biology or business ethics. So if the people at the Woke Council could not cancel culture me, that would be really cool. Instead, maybe they could give me the rank of passing privileged with some ifs, buts, and well, actuallys. So yeah, that would mean my opinion matters a little bit, but not really. I can go? Oh, good. Okay, thank you. But moving on to something that has nothing to do with any of that, let's talk about intersectionality. Part 1. Lesbians and gays support the miners. The film Pride, released in 2014, is based on a true story about a small group of queer activists in 1980s London who started a fundraising campaign called Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners. Their aim was to raise money to support the families of British miners who had been on strike for almost a year. But because miners lived outside of the metropolitan centres, and because it was the 80s, they were often associated with homophobia, and the donations from the queer activists were rejected by every union branch in the country, apart from one. The only people who accepted their donations were from a small village in South Wales, and the story follows the growing relationship between these two radically different communities. The gays are initially met with frosty suspicion and outright bigotry, which later evolves into a very warming story of genuine curiosity and acceptance as the film progresses. The miners are invited to a festival in London where they raise thousands of pounds for the movement. The groups are both routinely smeared by the tabloid press. There's a scene where the gay men help the miners improve their game by teaching them to dance. And there's a bit where the old village ladies are drunk and rummaging through their lesbian comrades' collection of sex toys. So, all that fun stuff. Of course, the miners lost in the end, and after a year of the most intense industrial action since the 1920s, the strike was broken. But the story of the queer community's contribution had spread across the country, and on the Gay Pride Parade in 1985, thousands of miners were bussed in to join the movement. Not long afterwards, the British Labour Party incorporated gay and lesbian rights into their official programme, and the main group that pressured them to do this was the National Union of Mine Workers. This film is very good, and you should watch it. Move aside, Lindsay Ellis. Fuck you, Big Joel. But I've started this video by talking about it because I think it explains intersectionality in a clearer way than any academic definition ever could. Gay people and miners in the 1980s weren't meant to get along. Although most of the gay characters in the film are working class, they're still perceived by the miners as fancy cosmopolitans, as if they're middle class by default, regardless of their income. Mining communities, on the other hand, were seen by people from the cities as backwards, socially conservative, and bigoted. One of the gay characters in particular is especially wary about associating with miners after their experience of having to come out in a small mining village. And even to this day, research shows that coming out is still hardest for people from working class backgrounds. And on the other end, well-intentioned people from the mining community were treated with hostility by gay activists who expected them to be homophobic by default. But rather than competing for a monopoly of oppression, with one group saying it's all about class and the other saying it's all about sexuality, both groups were able to intersect against a common aggressor. For the miners, it was pit closures without compensation, police brutality, and mass surveillance from a ferociously anti-union Conservative Party. And for the gays, it was this.
Children who need to be taught to respect traditional moral values are being taught that they have an inalienable right to be gay. All of those children are being cheated of a sound start in life. Yes, cheated.
So the overarching message here is one of solidarity. As the main character of the film puts it,
I've never understood what's the point of supporting gay rights, but nobody else's rights, you know? Or workers' rights, but not women's rights. It's, I don't know, illogical.
But although the messaging here is pretty simple, it does manage to give us a richer understanding of the events, even if you know the history quite well, especially if you contrast it with something like The Iron Lady, a much more well-known film which essentially tells the same story, but from the perspective of the country's first woman prime minister, fighting a righteous battle against a male chauvinist political class on one front and thuggish trade unionists on the other. In other words, upper-class, exclusionary pop feminism. Not very intersectional, very cringe, we do not stan. I f***ing hate saying that. So now that we have a good idea of what intersectionality looks like in practice, let's look at the theory. Part 2. Kimberle Crenshaw. The term intersectionality was coined in 1989 by the American lawyer Kimberle Crenshaw in a paper which looked at the intersection between race and gender, with a particular focus on black women. She argued that black women in the US faced a unique mode of oppression that wasn't being adequately addressed by feminists or by anti-racists. This, she said, was because feminist discourse was dominated by white women and anti-racist discourse by black men, meaning any issues that uniquely affected black women were going unnoticed. So this is essentially a critique of identity politics, which she claimed had a tendency to conflate or ignore differences within groups. In a less well-known paper, she demonstrated this problem by looking at domestic abuse, where she makes what I think is a very strong case supporting affirmative action for female victims. Wait, did I say affirmative action? Oh shit.
Affirmative action is racist, okay? Alright, it is a far-left policy designed to tell you, white people, I don't care how hard you worked, because you are privileged, and we are going to defer your taxpayers' money to help the black population while you sit back and reflect on that privilege, alright? And I'll tell you something else. This is what the Democrats won, alright? Alright, they won legal discrimination on the basis of race, and you know what else they're saying? They're saying, fuck the Civil Rights Act, alright? Did these people remember what Martin Luther King said? Judge me not by the color of my skin, but by the contents of my character.
Okay, so notwithstanding all the botched projects of corporations and universities, Crenshaw hints at an argument for affirmative action that is a lot less well known. The argument she infers is that even if you control for the number of victims, crisis centers in black areas need more funding than those in white areas. What? Well, based on research from the 1980s, Crenshaw found that crisis centers with equal amounts of funding were performing worse in black areas even when they were dealing with similar numbers of victims. This was because feminist research had exclusively focused on white areas where victims were more likely to have access to temporary accommodation, meaning it was easier for them to escape from their abusers. The result was that alternative housing was seen in crisis centers as a low priority. But in black areas with a long history of housing and employment discrimination, victims didn't have the same support networks as those in white areas, and their need for alternative accommodation was much more urgent. So the people who worked in crisis centers had to deal with a problem that was specific to black areas with a budget that was designed to work in white areas. As a result, crisis centers in white communities performed relatively well, whilst those in ethnic communities had a much higher level of failure and burnout amongst counselors who were under-equipped to help the victims. This also meant that black victims had a much harder time escaping abusive relationships, which made rates of domestic violence in black areas disproportionately high. Obviously, right-wing commentators would eagerly put this down to cultural defects in the black community, but the lack of intersectionality in anti-racist movements meant they were unable to effectively counter these claims. Crenshaw highlighted a case where the LAPD had withheld stats on domestic violence in different precincts because activists were worried about people using the data to paint domestic violence as a race problem. She argued that without intersectionality, The dominant anti-racist strategy against racial stereotyping had ended up pushing black women out of the conversation. Her paper also included the infamous trial of Mike Tyson versus Desiree Washington, where Tyson had been found guilty of raping an 18-year-old woman in his hotel room. Crenshaw noticed that not a single established black leader had supported Washington during the trial. Instead, Louis Farrakhan and several other black leaders, as well as a number of black women, openly smeared Washington and accused her of lying. The ones who did believe her gave the typical response that she had no business being in Tyson's room at 2 a.m. and that she had asked for it. According to Crenshaw, the rhetoric and pre-established practices of anti-racist movements had prepared black leaders to defend Tyson by default as a victim of racist stereotyping. Despite the fact, she says, that black men accused of rape are treated far more leniently by the criminal justice system if their victims are black women. But rather than trying to dismiss the problem of false accusations against black men, Crenshaw argues that these issues can be taken just as seriously without the kind of downplaying that happened in the Tyson trial, especially since black women are more likely to be raped than black men are to be accused of it. And I think this is her most crucial point. The intersectionality isn't a zero-sum game of different groups competing for attention. It's a way of showing how much these groups need one another. In the miners' strike, the gay activists only had support from one town, but still managed to raise over £20,000 for the miners' families. That's the equivalent of £70,000 today. Their willingness to campaign with a community well known for homophobia continued to pay off even years after the strike had ended. In 1988, the miners' union was one of the most vocal opponents of Section 28. In other words, class and sexuality were not mutually exclusive. So if someone says something like, all this identity politics stuff is a waste of time, it's a distraction from the real issue, and that real issue is class, the intersectional response would be, it's both, you f***ing idiot. Part 3. PragerU. So now that we know what intersectionality is, maybe we should see what PragerU has to say about it. And not just so we can all point and say, look, there's Ben Jabronio, he's wrong about the things. Because I think his perspective is a bit more interesting than that. First of all, his definition of intersectionality includes the following.
Intersectionality is a form of identity politics in which the value of your opinion depends on how many victim groups you belong to. At the bottom of the totem pole is the person everybody loves to hate, the straight white male. How does this intersectionality thing play out? Something like this. Let's say you're a gay white woman. Your opinion matters, but less than that of a gay black woman. Why? Because while all women are oppressed by the patriarchy, and all gays are oppressed by the heterosexual majority, blacks have a victim status that whites obviously don't. Of course, a gay black woman's victim status is less than that of a black trans woman, who ranks below a black Muslim trans woman, and so on. The more memberships you can claim in oppressed groups, the more aggrieved you are, and the higher you rank.
So intersectionality is when the more victim groups you're in, the more your opinion matters. And I just wonder, Ben Shabibo, do you have a citation for that? If I scroll down to the description, will I find a list of all the different victim groups and how many units of oppression each one is worth? Well, no. There won't be any evidence. It's a PragerU video. But the weird thing is, there are a couple of points where Ben just about gets it right. When he says black gay women will have it harder than white gay women, and that black gay trans women will have it worse than them, and so on, that is generally true. The incredibly high murder rate of trans women in America is mostly made up of black victims, for example. That makes sense, Ben Shabubu. Quick, let's add some value of opinion meters and give the trans women some beefy gains because God forbid we represent our opponents accurately. But this seems to be Ben's weapon of choice for the video. To describe intersectionality kind of accurately, but then to add some insane strawman at the end just to make sure everyone watching knows it's bad. And he does it again. With the theory out of the way, he moves on to the practice, and talks about how intersectionality can bring unlikely groups together over a shared cause. And just when you think he's on the cusp of getting it, he finishes by sliding in what he thinks is the left's default enemy, the straight white male.
Here's the logic. A black gay and a Hispanic gay may not belong to the same victim group racially, but they do belong to the same victim group on the basis of their sexuality. By focusing on the places where various victim identities intersect, intersectionality creates a united us versus them paradigm. Righteous victims rising up together to fight the oppressor, those dreaded straight white men.
So, first of all, intersectionality isn't just about victim groups. It's about all groups. The leaders of the civil rights movement were straight males, and their allies in the anti-war movement had plenty of straight white males. The miners in Pride were almost all straight white males. Their gay allies were mostly white, and the prime minister they were fighting against was a woman. Which brings us to our second problem. Why is he choosing to focus on straight white males? Apparently he thinks intersectionality looks like this, when, in reality, it looks a bit more like this. What if the straight white male is disabled, mentally ill, or living in poverty? You'll notice in Ben's examples of intersectionality, he conveniently misses out the category of class. Why would that be? In the PragerU version of intersectionality, does a straight white homeless man have the same oppression status as a Wall Street billionaire? Or are they themselves trying to get people with very different interests to intersect against a common enemy? Yes. And I know it's a cliche, but it is a PragerU video, so this is doublethink. Because on the one hand, there's a group of hypersensitive snowflakes competing for oppression points, and on the other, there's an oppression hierarchy belittling and invalidating the opinions of straight white males the world over. So when PragerU lumps all the straight white males together and puts them against the woke, cancel culturing, Antifa, Bidenista mob, they're doing intersectionality. And isn't this exactly how conservatives respond to, say, the idea of white privilege? Because if your response to white privilege is to say something like, well, I'm autistic and I grew up in poverty with a single parent, how can you call me privileged? That's basically valid because of intersectionality. If your argument against feminism is to talk about male suicide rates or gender discrimination in family courts, which both have a lot to do with toxic masculinity and patriarchy, by the way, you're doing intersectionality. In this video, Ben has very carefully chosen the identities that are least likely to harbor conservative values, and then used them to frame intersectionality as something that is opposed to his audience. If he had substituted the black Muslim trans lesbian for, say, a short working class man with a squeaky voice and a weak chin, his example would still be valid, but he would risk splitting his target audience. This is Ben Bambino's intersectionality. Whether you're rich or poor, literate or illiterate, neurotypical or neurodivergent, a 6-foot stud in a dress or a tiny man with a sword, the message is, straight white males of the world, unite. When the union's inspiration through the workers' blood shall run, there can be no power greater anywhere beneath the sun. Yet what force on earth is weaker than the feeble strength of one? But the union makes us strong. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.